In the spring of 1943, somewhere in the frozen mountains of Arctic Norway, a single man was crawling through the snow. One of his boots was gone. His feet were turning black with frostbite. The Germans were hunting him, the temperature was far below freezing, and the nearest safety was a wall of mountains away in another country. He was alone, half-blind and starving. By every rule of survival, he should have died out there within days. Instead, Jan Baalsrud would spend the next 2 months clawing his way toward the border, and an entire chain of ordinary people would risk everything to keep him alive. This is one of the greatest survival and rescue stories of the Second World War. Jan Baalsrud was born in Oslo in 1917, a quiet young instrument maker with no thought of war. Then, in April 1940, Nazi Germany invaded Norway and occupied his country. Like thousands of young Norwegians, Baalsrud refused to simply live under the swastika. He escaped Norway, made his way to Britain, and was trained as a commando in the Norwegian Independent Company, the legendary unit known as Kompani Linge. Their job was to slip back into occupied Norway and light the fires of resistance. The lifeline between Britain and northern Norway was a secret operation the Norwegians called the Shetland Bus, small fishing boats that crossed the brutal North Sea by night, carrying agents, weapons and radios past the German patrols. In March 1943, Baalsrud boarded one of those boats. The mission was codenamed Operation Martin. 12 men sailed on a fishing cutter called the Brattholm, loaded with 8 tons of explosives and weapons. Their task was to organize the local resistance and destroy a German air control tower in the far north. On the 29th of March 1943, the Brattholm slipped into a tiny ice-rimmed inlet called Toftefjord, near the city of Tromsø. They had crossed the sea. Now they only had to make contact with the resistance on shore. And there, the whole operation came apart. Trying to find their local contact, the men approached a shopkeeper who happened to share the same name. Frightened, he reported them. Within hours, the Germans knew exactly where the Brattholm was hidden. On the 30th of March, a German naval ship rounded the headland and opened fire on the little fishing boat. The Norwegians had seconds to act. To keep 8 tons of explosives and their secret papers out of German hands, they set fire to the Brattholm and blew her up in a single enormous blast, then scrambled for the shore under a hail of gunfire. It was a massacre. Of the 12 men, all but 1 were killed in the fighting or captured, and the captured were later tortured and executed. Only Jan Baalsrud got away. As he fled, he lost a boot in the freezing water, and a German bullet tore off part of his big toe. Soaked, bleeding, and with 1 foot bare in the snow, he ran for the mountains. Behind him lay the bodies of his friends. Ahead of him lay nothing but ice. Baalsrud was now utterly alone in occupied territory, in the Arctic in winter, with 1 ruined foot, and the entire German garrison searching for him. He waded and swam through freezing channels of seawater between the islands, his clothes turning to ice on his body. And then, slowly, the thing that would truly save his life began to happen. He knocked on a door, and the people behind it chose to help him. This was the great danger and the great miracle of his escape. Sheltering a hunted commando meant death, for you and often for your whole family. And yet, door after door, farm after farm, ordinary Norwegians took Jan Baalsrud in, fed him and dried him, and passed him on toward the next hiding place. But the Arctic was working against him. The glare of endless snow struck him with snow blindness, leaving him sightless for days. The frostbite in his feet deepened, and the flesh began to die. Gangrene set in, the kind of infection that untreated would climb his legs and kill him. A small group of villagers in a place called Furuflaten took the most terrible risk of all. They decided to carry him up and over the mountains toward neutral Sweden. They hauled him on a sledge up into the high country and left him hidden on a frozen plateau to wait for guides who would take him across. Then the weather turned. A blizzard roared in and sealed the mountains for days that stretched into weeks. Baalsrud lay trapped in the open, burrowed into the snow, unable to move, slowly starving, drifting in and out of consciousness as the storm screamed over him. Alone in that snow hole, he watched the gangrene spreading through his toes. So he did the only thing he could. With a pocket knife and no anesthetic, Jan Baalsrud began to amputate his own toes, one by one, to stop the rot from killing him. What kept him alive was not just his own iron will, it was a conspiracy of decency. Down in the valleys, a whole network of farmers, fishermen and housewives was working in secret to save a man most of them had never met. They smuggled food up the mountain to him. They carried messages at the risk of their lives. They came back again and again through the snow to check whether the stranger on the plateau was still breathing, because to abandon him now was unthinkable. For weeks, the rescue hung by a thread. The Germans patrolled the valleys. The weather refused to break. More than once, Baalsrud was given up for dead, only for his rescuers to climb back up and find a faint spark of life still in him. The last and hardest leg of the journey could only be done by people who truly knew that country, the indigenous Sami, the reindeer herders of the far north. The Sami harnessed their reindeer to a sledge, hid the half-dead commando aboard, and set out across the high frontier plateau towards Sweden, driving through German-patrolled mountains with a wanted man buried under their gear. And at last, after 2 months on the run, after the sea and the snow and the gangrene and the storms had each tried to kill him, the sledge crossed an invisible line in the white wilderness, the border into neutral Sweden. Jan Baalsrud was safe. He had survived roughly 60 days of one of the most hostile environments on Earth, hunted the entire way. He had lost most of his toes, but he was alive, carried to freedom on the shoulders and the courage of strangers. Baalsrud recovered in Sweden and went back to the war, serving until the liberation of Norway. He could never quite escape the weight of what it had cost. His comrades from the Brattholm executed, and the constant knowledge that dozens of civilians had put their lives on the line for him. His story was written down after the war by David Howarth in a book called We Die Alone. The title is almost an irony, because the whole point of Jan Baalsrud's escape is that, in the end, he did not die, precisely because he was not left alone. For the rest of his life, Baalsrud stayed close to the people of the north who had saved him. When he died in 1988, he asked to be buried among them in the valley of Mandalen, laid to rest beside the families who had risked everything to carry a wounded stranger over the mountains. We remember the survival, the bare foot in the snow, the knife, the blizzard, the will to live, but that is only half of it. The other half is the quiet army of ordinary people who decided that one man's life was worth the risk of their own. Jan Baalsrud lived because a whole community refused to look away. And that, in the darkest winter of the war, is a kind of light worth remembering.